So the Steam Next Fest was going on recently. Like the few Steam Fests before it, a ton of free indie game demos flooded the front page. We finally got a first look at games that were in development for years on end, never touched by the public before. A couple of those games already had a lot of hype going in, but most of them I'd never heard of before. So I picked out a couple interesting games and took a few suggestions from the internet as well. Some good, some bad, all worth talking about. So without further ado, let's see what the Steam Next Fest had to offer. So it looks like Hotline Miami 3 is finally here. It's been a long time, but at least the graphics took a big jump since the last one. But seriously, this is Angerfoot. Unsurprisingly, it's being published by Devolver Digital, the same people who brought us Hotline Miami. It's a very goofy, fast-paced FPS with lots of instant death and a killer soundtrack. The gameplay is very straightforward, mostly just clearing out enemies on your way to a finish line. But instead of the melee combat you'd expect from the genre, you have a super-powered kick, capable of launching nearly anything at Mach speed. My only minor gripe is that the kick comes out a little bit slow for how fast everything else is in the game. Both you and the enemies often die in a single hit, so those few fractions of a second really matter. Compare it to Arcane's Might and Magic, an old game with another overpowered kick. It felt much better in that game, mainly due to the speed that it came out. But that aside, the VFX are excellent, the destructible environments feel great, the writing is pretty goofy, and the music is obviously bumping. The demo levels featured some solid tracks, but not quite on the level of Hotline Miami's excellent soundtrack. Oh, and just like in Hotline Miami, you can pretty much cheese most levels by standing next to a door and spamming melee. But that aside, Angerfoot accomplishes exactly what it sets out to do. It's definitely going to be big when it finally comes out. Cultic is the first of many boomer shooters I played throughout the fest. The genre seems to be going through a big revival period, which is always cool to see. This one feels like it'd be right at home alongside the old Duke, Quake, Doom, and Unreal games. Or if you prefer a more modern take, it felt very similar to Dusk. The gameplay was pretty solid and well polished all around, but nothing really unexpected. And that's totally fine, not every game needs to reinvent the wheel. On the other hand, the art has a more noticeably unique style. The colorful pixel art textures and 2D objects look great. But the one thing that I thought felt out of place were the voxel models, as in those models that are all made up of small 3D cubes. I'm personally not a huge fan of voxels, but if the style is consistent, it can be fine. Oddly, the game features both regular 3D models and voxel models, plus some 2D objects, like weapons and enemies. I think it would look better and more cohesive if they just stuck with the 2D objects and 3D models instead of jamming 3 different styles into one game. But like I said before, the game is still very solid all around. Boomer shooter fans should definitely keep an eye on this one. The Fridge is Red is a low-poly VHS horror anthology, just like 10,000 other indie horror games in the past few years. Except this one has a killer fridge, incredibly vague puzzles, and VHS filters so strong it'll make your eyes bleed. Listen, I play a ton of indie horror games, and I'm generally very forgiving when it comes to them. But this game really felt like any of the other countless game jam projects you'd find on itch.io every single day. They tease you with some interesting visuals, but the game itself felt very derivative. The puzzles are pretty opaque and not very interesting to figure out. And even as someone who can handle heavy filters, the visuals here just felt excessive. I'm also fairly sure that the game broke a few times, like this doll that appears clickable but does nothing, or a final letter for the fridge scene that seems to have never spawned in, despite checking literally everywhere. Anyways, I'm only going so hard on this because, unlike all those other games I mentioned before, this one actually got picked up for sale by a major publisher. I personally didn't feel like it did enough to set itself apart from any of the hundreds of tiny indie horror games I've played for free elsewhere, but I guess the publishers saw some more promise in it, so maybe it's just not for me. Speaking of horror games, we have Signalis, yet another highly anticipated game in the Twitterverse. This one is more of a throwback to the old school Resident Evil and Silent Hill style survival horror. Pretty standard stuff, but the visuals set it apart by a mile. I was constantly questioning if a professional UI artist worked on this game because the UI and menus consistently impressed me throughout. The pixel art was nice and the 3D models were okay, but geez, just look at these menus. It's like somebody mainlined a ton of 90s cyberpunk movies and anime and then somehow ended up animating something even better than 90% of them. Anyways, it's pretty reminiscent of Evangelion, which is always cool. As for the rest of the game, it's your standard early 2000s survival horror, packed with inconsequential enemies, inventory management, vague puzzles, and plenty of backtracking. If you like that stuff, it'll be right up your alley, but if you prefer more action in your horror, maybe you'll skip this one. Anyways, huge props to the artist behind this game. Can't say there are many other games where I can go off on a tangent about the UI. Deadlink is a roguelike arena shooter with some cartoony visuals. Something like Borderlands without the goofy characters and meme humor. I played it for a bit, but soon realized that it probably isn't for me. The gameplay was pretty polished and the art was nice enough, but I didn't feel much motivation to continue on. I don't mind the arena shooter or roguelike formats, but there wasn't much meat to the story to feel like I was doing anything more than blasting some guys and walking on to the next room. Pick it up if you like the gameplay and don't mind minimal character and story development. Fashion Police Squad may fit in with the boomer shooters in gameplay, but everything else about it sets it far apart from the rest. You play as a suitably sassy member of the Fashion Police, patrolling the streets for fashion crimes to take out. Each enemy can only be hurt by one of your guns or abilities, meaning you have to make use of all your tools to progress. This is a little bit different from other boomer shooters, where you're usually given an arsenal of weapons, but enemies are vulnerable to all of them. Not that either philosophy is better, just different. Anyways, the writing is pretty light and snappy, featuring lots of fashion-related puns and minor gags. I thought the writing worked pretty well with the gameplay, but more voice acting could really take it to the next level. That, and the music was either mixed too low or just not unique enough to really notice. I mean, I remember hearing music, but it felt kind of generic and oddly quiet for such a bubbly game. On the other hand, the visuals are great. Highly reminiscent of Mega Man Legends for the PS1, one of my favorite games from back in the day. Overall, Fashion Police Squad seems to be coming along great, and I'm definitely interested to see where they go with this in the future. Neon Blight is basically Enter the Gungeon, but with a management minigame where you run a gun shop. That second part is the main reason I looked into it, but oddly enough I never actually experienced it in the demo. Instead I played a few rounds, fighting through countless rooms where trees constantly blocked my view of enemies and bullets, making for a pretty big annoyance. I collected a couple guns that all felt pretty clunky to use, and fought a boss with seemingly way too much health for what I assumed was a tutorial. I never did end up seeing that gun shop owner side of the game. Maybe it wasn't ready for the demo, or maybe I had to progress further in the roguelike portion to unlock it. Who knows? Since I can only judge it based on that roguelike bit, I didn't have that much fun with it. Just your standard top-down shooter with some slightly randomized elements. Oh well, on to the next. Selaco is yet another boomer shooter in the lineup for this year. But unlike all the others, this one's actually made in GZ Doom, which is a Doom modding engine. If I hadn't heard about this beforehand, I'd have no idea it was made in a Doom engine. I mean, it has things you'd expect like 2D enemies, but it's surprisingly polished all around. The guns feel nice to use, the levels are pretty interactive, the enemies have unique AI patterns, and the environments are highly destructible. Although, it seems like they're trying to pack a ton of stuff into this game, and I'm wondering if it's for the best. Like when you go to start a new game, first you see Campaign and Incursions. So you click Campaign and you have to pick from 5 different difficulty levels with 2 bonus modes, Selaco Must Fall and Narrative Only mode. After that you have to pick from 3 playstyles, Traditional, Hardcore, and Randomizer, with an extra option to start with an assault rifle for some reason. Many other aspects of the game feel similarly cluttered and potentially unnecessary. I mean, sure, it's cool that they have all these features, and I know some people will use them. But game development is an often limiting process, constantly deciding what to cut to make the game shippable and not ever growing like Star Citizen or something. It seems like they've fallen down the rabbit hole of feature creep, adding in all these minor modes and modifiers instead of focusing on the core game that they could release to the public. I don't doubt the devs based on what they've done so far, but this strikes me as very likely to be an early access game that spends years and years adding minor features instead of reaching that full release state. But hey, I could always be wrong. I'm just giving you my personal opinion from working in the industry myself. Feature creep is a real killer, but at least the game is cool so far. So that's all the games I played in the Steam Next Fest. Some good, some bad. Great art here, boring puzzles there, cool concept here, bad execution there, everything across the board, pretty much as expected. Personally, I think Cultic had the best gameplay, Fashion Police Squad had the best writing, Signalis had the best art, and Angerfoot kept me entertained the longest. I think that's enough for first impressions, so I'll wrap it up here. As always, if you enjoyed the video and want to help support the channel, subscribing helps out a lot. If there's any games you enjoyed from the Steam Next Fest, let me know in the comments. And credit to all the developers for releasing these demos for free to the public. I hope they're all able to gather some good feedback and put it towards making the best games possible. But I guess only time will tell.